Hi there, and welcome to Coup English. In this series, we explore the lives of amazing people and help you improve your English at the same time. Ready? Let's dive in. Silent Revolution: The Life and Legacy of Joseph Lister. Chapter 1. Whispers in the Nursery: A Childhood and Change. The streets of Upton, a quiet village on the fringes of London, were still lined with the soft rustle of horse-drawn carts when Joseph Lister was born on April 5, 1827. The air was brisk with spring, and the city beyond the hills was stirring with a new century's ambitions. England stood on the cusp of the Industrial Revolution, a world shifting from steam to steel, from superstition to science. It was into this restless landscape that young Joseph entered the world, the fourth of 7 children born to Joseph Jackson Lister and Isabella Harris. Joseph's home was not like others. The Listers were devout Quakers, and their household was a haven of simplicity, silence, and structure. The children were raised without pomp, without indulgence, and with an early sense that life was not for pleasure but for purpose. The Quaker faith emphasized discipline, humility, and inner light, beliefs that subtly carved themselves into Joseph's developing character. Yet within this quiet environment, ideas bloomed. Conversations around the Lister dinner table often leaned toward ethics, natural phenomena, and the marvels of the world beyond their garden wall. His father, Joseph Jackson Lister, was not only a successful wine merchant, but also a passionate amateur scientist. He spent countless hours behind the microscope, chasing clarity in a world of blurs. Not satisfied with the optical limitations of the era, he revolutionized lens design, paving the way for the modern compound microscope. His study was filled with glass slides, carefully drawn sketches of cells, and tools Joseph couldn't yet name but watched with wide eyes. It was here, in the glowing lamplight of that quiet study, that the boy first met the invisible world and was enchanted. Young Joseph was not a rambunctious child, where his peers climbed trees and kicked stones in the lanes. He preferred quiet pursuits. He spent hours sketching, reading, or dissecting the petals of flowers, often speaking little but observing much. His mother, Isabella, nurtured this quiet nature with gentle encouragement. She read to him often passages from scripture, natural philosophy, or tales of explorers and reformers. Though frail in health, her moral presence loomed large in Joseph's early memories. She was a woman of devotion and intellect, guiding the children not just in belief, but in curiosity. At school, Joseph was not the fastest or the loudest, but teachers remembered his intensity. He approached learning with a kind of quiet rigor. His notebooks were filled with precise handwriting and delicate illustrations, not doodles, but anatomical diagrams and botanical dissections. His schoolmates often teased him for being too serious, too delicate, but Joseph seemed untouched by the noise of boyhood politics. His mind was elsewhere, often in the microcosmic. By his teenage years, his interests turned toward anatomy and medicine, though no dramatic event sparked this interest. It was, as many saw, a slow unfolding. He had once watched his father examining a drop of pond water under the microscope and seen, to his amazement, hundreds of tiny living organisms darting across the lens. That moment, almost imperceptible in its importance, stayed with him. The idea that life could be teeming in a single drop, yet invisible to the eye, captivated him. The Listers, though Quakers, were not strict in restricting worldly ambition. Joseph was encouraged to pursue higher learning, and in 1844, at the age of 17, he was admitted to University College London. The decision was not casual. It was a carefully considered step, both practical and philosophical. University College, unlike Oxford and Cambridge, accepted students regardless of religious affiliation, a crucial point for a young Quaker in Victorian Britain. In London, Joseph entered a different world. The cobbled calm of Upton gave way to the thrum of the capital. Gaslights, crowded streets, and the overwhelming scent of smoke and sewage formed the city's aroma. Yet Joseph adapted. He studied the classics, mathematics, and natural philosophy, but it was in anatomy that he found a home. The dissecting room, with its pungent air and raw bodies, unnerved many students. Joseph, however, showed none of the usual discomfort. He approached the cadaver as he had a flower in his boyhood garden, with precision, care, and an almost spiritual reverence. He wrote to his father often during this time. In his letters, there was no bravado, no romanticism, only clarity, his desire to understand, to explore, and to do no harm. He described his studies not with excitement, but with quiet devotion, as though medicine were a sacred calling, not a career. That sense of calling deepened in 1846 when he witnessed his first major operation. The scene was brutal. There were no antiseptics, no anesthetics, and no guarantee the patient would survive. The surgeon worked quickly, drenched in sweat and blood, while medical students watched silently from the gallery. Joseph stood among them, deeply affected. It wasn't the spectacle that stirred him, but the chaos. Infection often followed such surgeries. Many patients did not survive the aftermath, even if the operation was a success. This would become the question that haunted his career. Why did people die even when the knife was skillfully handled? The answer would take years to uncover, and the journey would be long and solitary. But in that moment, young Joseph Lister, gentle, observant, and quietly determined, knew he could not look away. He never would. Chapter 2. Seeds of Curiosity, Education, and Early Inspirations. University College London, in the mid-1840s, was a place of contrast, a mixture of tradition and transformation, of dusty lecture halls and burgeoning scientific curiosity. For Joseph Lister, the change from the quiet serenity of Upton to the thrumming center of academic life was both overwhelming and exhilarating. He was only 17, soft-spoken, and unfashionably earnest, but his eyes, always searching, missed little. The university environment introduced him to ideas that stretched beyond his Quaker upbringing. He found himself among students from all walks of life, some driven by ambition, others by wealth, and a rare few, like himself, by a solemn sense of duty. What set Joseph apart wasn't brilliance, though he had plenty of that, but his attitude, humble, methodical, and insatiably curious. His first year was rigorous. Latin, Greek, physics, and chemistry filled his days, but it was anatomy that drew him in with quiet magnetism. The human body, with its elaborate networks and silent rhythms, fascinated him. He didn't merely want to know what things were, he wanted to know why they failed, how they healed, and where the limits of life lay. In 1847, he enrolled in medical school, also at University College. The choice had never really been in question. Surgery was calling to him, not for its drama, but for its complexity. At that time, however, surgery was less a precise science than a brutal craft. Speed was often more prized than accuracy, as there were no anesthetics until very recently, and infection was almost guaranteed. Hospitals were riddled with what physicians grimly called ward rot. It was not uncommon for a patient to survive an operation but die shortly after, their wounds overcome by invisible forces that no one yet understood. Lister, however, did not accept the unknown easily. He recorded his observations with meticulous care, filling notebooks with notes, not only on procedures, but on healing, symptoms, and patient conditions. It was during these years that his attention began shifting, subtly but significantly, toward what others overlooked: the aftermath of surgery. In 1848, he became a pupil of Professor William Sharpie, a distinguished anatomist known for his dedication to empirical research. Sharpie saw in Joseph not just potential, but patience, a rare quality in young medical men. Under Sharpie's mentorship, Lister learned how to think more scientifically. Anatomy was no longer just about memorization. It was about relationships, function, adaptation. He was encouraged not only to observe but to question. Meanwhile, outside the lecture halls, the scientific world was changing. The discoveries of Louis Pasteur in France were beginning to ripple through Europe, though not yet widely accepted. Pasteur's germ theory, the idea that microorganisms were responsible for disease, offered a radical rethinking of illness. Lister, still early in his training, hadn't yet encountered these theories, but the foundation for their eventual collision had been laid. His mind, already attuned to detail, was fertile ground for such revolutionary ideas. During these formative years, Lister also endured a profound personal loss. His mother, Isabella, passed away after a long illness. Her death affected him deeply. While he rarely spoke of her publicly, those who knew him noticed a change, not a hardening, but a deeper seriousness. He became more withdrawn, more focused. His drive to understand the nature of suffering seemed only to intensify after her passing. Despite the grief, Joseph continued with his studies. In 1852, he graduated with distinction and was awarded a Bachelor of Medicine degree. He was then selected for a prestigious surgical apprenticeship under Professor James Syme at the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh, a turning point in his career and life. But before he left London, Lister made one final stop, the laboratory. He had developed a growing interest in pathology and histology, the microscopic study of tissues. His father's legacy with the microscope had come full circle. Joseph now began applying microscopic techniques to his medical studies. He observed diseased tissues, compared healthy cells with inflamed ones, and became convinced that the causes of infection were not mystical, but biological. He wrote often to his father during this time, their correspondence filled with a blend of scientific inquiry and familial warmth. In one letter, he described a specimen in great detail, noting how the arrangement of pus cells hinted at a process rather than a random occurrence. In another, he expressed frustration that so many surgeons seemed uninterested in what happened after their patients left the table. They operate, he wrote, but they do not observe. It was this obsession with what came next that would define his career. When the opportunity came to work with Syme in Edinburgh, Lister accepted without hesitation. Syme was considered the most skilled surgeon in Scotland, a man of talent and temperament, respected for both his innovation and unyielding standards. Though Syme's personality was volatile and his methods sometimes abrupt, Joseph found in him a mentor who challenged his assumptions and refined his technique. More importantly, Edinburgh exposed Lister to a new medical culture. Scottish medicine at the time was steeped in Enlightenment ideals, valuing inquiry, rigor, and skepticism. It was a place where questioning convention was not only allowed, it was expected. Joseph flourished. He developed a calm, confident hand in the operating theater and a reputation for thoughtfulness and thoroughness. He began to lecture, to write, and to carve out his place in a profession that still barely understood the consequences of its own practices. But it was not prestige he sought, not even success. He was still that boy from Upton, the one who had watched a droplet of water reveal hidden life. Surgery, to him, was not an art of the knife, but of healing, a process unfinished until the wound closed clean and the body restored itself without fever, pain, or death. That future, however, still seemed impossibly distant. The world had not yet learned to fear the unseen, but Joseph Lister had begun to suspect that the enemy was not in the blade, but in the air. He didn't know it yet, but he was standing at the edge of a silent revolution. Chapter 3. The Surgeon's Apprentice. Trials behind the Scalpel. Edinburgh in the early 1850s was a city of contrasts. Its skyline was marked by church spires and chimneys alike, its streets filled with the scent of damp stone, horse sweat, and distant sea air. The Royal Infirmary sat atop a hill, an austere building whose thick walls held more pain than cure. It was here that Joseph Lister arrived to begin the most rigorous and revealing chapter of his early medical life, as apprentice to James Syme, Scotland's most eminent surgeon. Syme was legendary, not just for his surgical precision, but for his force of will. He was known to be temperamental, quick to dismiss those he deemed careless or complacent. His presence in the operating theatre was electrifying, confident, commanding, and absolutely focused. Lister, still soft-spoken and modest, might have been overlooked in such a setting, but Syme saw something in the young Englishman, not just competence, but discipline, a rare quiet strength. From the start, Lister proved himself not by brilliance, but by diligence. He arrived before others, stayed after hours, and asked questions that many students would never have dared voice. He didn't seek shortcuts, nor did he perform for praise. He observed intently, absorbed everything, and developed a deep, almost spiritual reverence for the human body. The surgical conditions were primitive by today's standards. Instruments were reused without sterilization. Surgeons operated in street clothes. Blood soaked the aprons of students, and screams echoed through stone corridors as patients were strapped down, awake, during procedures. Anesthesia had only recently become available, ether and later chloroform, but infection remained a mystery. Even the most successful operations were often followed by agonizing deaths. Lister was horrified by the suffering, but not deterred. He took notes not just on the surgery, but on the aftermath. He recorded how long it took wounds to heal, how fevers rose and fell, how pus, often seen as a sign of healthy healing, actually seemed to herald decline. Most surgeons accepted this as the natural course of medicine. Lister, even then, questioned it. His letters home during this time showed the mental weight he carried. In one, he described an amputation. The limb was removed cleanly, but within days, the patient became pale and feverish. The wound festered, and there was nothing more we could do. His frustration was palpable. The surgery had gone perfectly, and yet the patient died. Again, amid these professional challenges came a personal twist. In Syme's household, Lister met his mentor's daughter, Agnes. She was quick-witted, educated, and unafraid to challenge opinions, even her father's. Agnes found Joseph's quiet manner intriguing. Unlike the brash young doctors who tried to impress her with stories of battlefield surgeries and academic prizes, Joseph listened. He asked questions. He shared ideas rather than flaunting them. Their relationship developed slowly, built on mutual respect and a shared interest in the medical world. Agnes often attended her father's lectures and read the medical journals Joseph brought home. In time, their conversations moved from the clinical to the personal. By 1856, they were engaged, a union that would become one of the great constants in Joseph's life. Agnes would not only become his wife, but his closest intellectual partner. Back at the infirmary, Lister's responsibilities grew. He was now assisting Syme directly, handling complex cases, and beginning to teach junior students. But unlike most surgeons of the time, Lister was never content with tradition. He began experimenting with new bandaging methods, carefully observing the impact of environmental cleanliness on recovery. He noted that patients placed in wards with better ventilation fared better. He cleaned his instruments more thoroughly than was customary. He even began gently urging nurses and assistants to wash their hands before handling open wounds, a suggestion met with some amusement. At this stage, Lister still lacked the scientific framework to explain what he sensed. The germ theory of disease had not yet entered the British medical mainstream, but he was gathering evidence slowly, quietly, rigorously, that something invisible was at play. There were setbacks, of course. Some patients died no matter what care he gave. Others developed infections that baffled even the most seasoned staff. One young boy, admitted with a compound leg fracture, underwent surgery under Lister's supervision. The operation was smooth, but within days, the wound turned black. Gangrene set in. Despite Lister's every effort, the boy succumbed. The case haunted him. But not all was grim. Lister also witnessed recoveries that felt miraculous, instances where his cautious attention to wound care seemed to make a difference. He began cataloging these, not triumphantly, but carefully, as a man building a case. He suspected that something in the air, or on the hands, or in the tools, was infecting patients. But, without proof, he continued to test, observe, refine. By 1856, Joseph Lister was no longer just a student. He had earned his MD and become a Fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons. He was offered a position as a surgical assistant, and later a professorship at the University of Glasgow, a chance to begin his own practice, build his own reputation, and explore his theories without the shadow of Syme, respected though it was. Before leaving Edinburgh, Joseph and Agnes married. Their wedding was small, intimate, and free of pomp, in keeping with their Quaker sensibilities. But it marked a quiet turning point in Lister's life. With Agnes at his side, he was no longer alone in his quiet pursuit of clarity. She encouraged him to speak more publicly, to write, to defend his ideas even when others mocked them. She would remain by his side through decades of challenge and discovery. As the train carried the couple westward toward Glasgow, Lister watched the Scottish hills roll by, their green expanse glowing under the pale sun. He carried with him not only surgical tools and books, but a growing certainty. The suffering he had seen was not inevitable. It was not fate. It was solvable. He just needed to prove it. Chapter 4. The Invisible Enemy. Encountering Infection. Glasgow greeted Joseph Lister with a cold wind and coal-streaked skies. It was 1860, and the city was humming with industrial energy ironworks, shipyards, and factories pumping black smoke into the low Scottish clouds. The air was thick with soot, and the pace of life relentless. But for Lister, this harsh new environment marked the beginning of something quietly revolutionary. He had been appointed professor of surgery at the University of Glasgow and surgeon at the Glasgow Royal Infirmary. Though still a relatively young man, Lister entered his new role with the poise and patience of someone twice his age. His Edinburgh years had seasoned him, and his quiet resolve had matured into a focused vision. He didn't come seeking prestige. He came to solve a mystery. The infirmary was a grim place. Most of the building was poorly ventilated, its corridors narrow and dark. The surgical ward, overcrowded and foul-smelling, bore the scars of decades of unclean practice. Patients arrived, broken, were operated on quickly, and many succumbed not to injury but to what doctors still called hospital diseases. Lister, methodical as ever, began his work with observation. He took stock of every case, recording temperature, wound condition, rate of healing or deterioration. His notebooks filled rapidly. He became particularly interested in compound fractures, injuries where the bone pierced the skin and was exposed to air. These were often fatal, despite competent surgery. In some cases, amputation was the only option, if the patient lived long enough to endure it. But something gnawed at Lister. These wounds did not always start badly. It was what happened after the surgery that disturbed him. The skin reddened, the area swelled, and then came the discharge, a thick, yellow-green pus. Soon after, fever, delirium, and death. Most surgeons saw this as an unavoidable consequence of injury. Lister did not. He began experimenting, not with patients, not recklessly, but with methods. He washed his hands more often, changed dressings more frequently, kept surgical tools apart from one another when not in use. Though crude by modern standards, these small gestures were radical at the time. Still, infection remained rampant. It was around this period that Lister encountered the writings of Louis Pasteur, the French chemist working on fermentation in wine and milk, had discovered that microbial life, germs, was responsible for spoilage. Pasteur's conclusion was daring. Decay was not a spontaneous event, but the result of contamination by living organisms. Lister read and reread Pasteur's essays. The implications hit him like a revelation. What if the same principles applied not just to milk, but to wounds? What if the ward rot that doctors so grimly accepted was not fate, but infection, spread invisibly by air, tools, or touch? The idea ran contrary to nearly all accepted medical thought. Most surgeons still adhered to miasma theory, the belief that disease was caused by bad air or corrupt atmospheres. But Lister's experiences in the operating theater, his years of quiet observation, and now Pasteur's findings all pointed in the same direction. He wrote to Pasteur, requesting clarification. Pasteur responded warmly, encouraging Lister's inquiries and offering further notes on his experiments. Their correspondence, though limited, formed a bond across disciplines, a chemist and a surgeon, united by a belief that science could defeat the unseen. Inspired, Lister turned to chemistry. If germs caused infection, then perhaps a chemical agent could kill them. He began searching for a substance that could cleanse wounds without damaging tissue. Carbolic acid, also known as phenol, caught his attention. It was being used in sewage treatment in Carlisle, a northern English town. The results were promising. The smell was neutralized, and waste did not fester as before. Could the same substance disinfect wounds? It was a risky idea. Carbolic acid was strong, even corrosive. Misused, it could burn skin or cause irritation. But Lister was cautious and deliberate. He began with laboratory experiments, soaking lint in diluted carbolic solution and applying it to samples of decaying tissue. The results were remarkable. The tissue did not putrefy. The smell, normally unbearable, was reduced. Encouraged, he moved carefully to clinical trials. His first major case was a young boy with a compound fracture of the leg, an injury that almost certainly would have required amputation. Lister cleaned the wound with carbolic solution, applied a carbolic-soaked dressing, and covered it with an airtight cloth. Then he waited. The boy improved. The wound did not fester. No fever, no delirium, no pus. The leg was saved. It was an astonishing success, but Lister remained cautious. He repeated the treatment on other patients, refining the concentration, adjusting the technique. The results were consistent. Wounds healed cleanly. Infection rates dropped. The dreaded hospital gangrene was kept at bay. Yet, when Lister presented his findings, the response was lukewarm at best. Many colleagues scoffed. The idea that unseen organisms caused infection sounded fantastical. Carbolic acid, some said, was dangerous. Others accused Lister of overcomplicating surgery. One famously declared, "What we cannot see cannot hurt us." Lister didn't argue. He simply kept operating and documenting. His notes, case by case, built a mountain of quiet evidence. There was no single epiphany, no dramatic moment of applause. Just patients who lived when they might have died. Limbs saved, fevers avoided, mothers reunited with children. Behind every success, he saw not triumph, but confirmation. The invisible enemy was real, and it could be beaten. Chapter 5. A Spark in Glasgow. The Carbolic Breakthrough. By the spring of 1867, the halls of the Glasgow Royal Infirmary were filled with murmurs, not just of patients in pain, but of speculation. Something strange was happening under the direction of Professor Joseph Lister. Patients with compound fractures, wounds that usually turned foul within days, were now recovering cleanly. Surgeons and students alike began to notice. No screams from fevered wards, no foul smell of rotting flesh, no limbs blackened by gangrene. Lister remained calm, almost detached. He had no interest in spectacle. He didn't seek acclaim. What he sought, obsessively, quietly, was proof. He had now been using carbolic acid as an antiseptic in surgeries for nearly a year. After each operation, he cleaned the wound with diluted carbolic solution, soaked lint in the same liquid, and carefully applied the dressing. Then he covered the area with a waterproof, oiled silk cloth to prevent air exposure. This, he believed, formed a protective barrier against germs, now his greatest adversary. But Lister didn't just do. He measured. He recorded every case, wound condition, days to healing, presence of discharge, signs of fever. Over time, a pattern emerged. Where carbolic was used, infection rates plummeted. In some wards, mortality fell by more than half. And yet, many in the medical world remained unconvinced. In August of that same year, Lister published a groundbreaking series of articles in The Lancet, one of Britain's most respected medical journals, titled On the Antiseptic Principle in the Practice of Surgery. These writings laid out his methods, logic, and results. With clarity and restraint, he explained the theory that germs in the air, on instruments, or on hands caused post-surgical infection, and with equal precision, he explained how carbolic acid could prevent it. The articles were met with curiosity and resistance. Many British surgeons dismissed the idea outright. Germs were invisible, and therefore too many, implausible. To change one's entire surgical practice based on a French chemist's theory and one reserved professor's experience, it seemed absurd. Some found the carbolic method cumbersome. Others claimed it made operations longer and the wounds more irritated. A few tried it and gave up after a case or two went poorly. Lister, however, knew that progress would never arrive by popular vote. He continued working, refining his methods, adjusting concentrations of carbolic acid, finding better materials for dressing. He trained his students carefully, emphasizing not only technique, but mindset. Cleanliness was not optional, it was central. Gloves, clean tools, disinfected surfaces, careful dressing, everything now had a role in fighting what could not be seen. Among his students, a small group became quietly devoted to his approach. These young surgeons carried his ideas beyond Glasgow, back to London, Manchester, Dublin, and eventually across the sea to Europe and America. But still, outside his immediate circle, skepticism dominated. One of Lister's most well-known successes during this time involved a young woman with a severe compound fracture of her arm, sustained in a carriage accident. The wound was deep, bone exposed, and splinters embedded in the surrounding tissue. In earlier years, such a case would have meant certain amputation, or worse, but Lister insisted on treating it conservatively. He cleaned the wound thoroughly, irrigated it with carbolic solution, and dressed it using his now standard antiseptic method. Over the following days, the patient remained fever-free. The wound showed no sign of infection. Slowly, the tissues regenerated. The arm was saved. The patient left the hospital weeks later, not only alive, but whole. Word of cases like these began to trickle into the wider medical conversation. Though many still doubted Lister's theory, they could not deny the outcomes. Behind the operating table, however, Lister remained his same quiet self. He never shouted, never boasted. His voice in the theater was soft but firm. He demanded discipline and attention to detail, but he taught with patience. To him, surgery was not war. It was stewardship. At home, Agnes continued to be his confidant and intellectual companion. She helped him edit his papers, reviewed his notes, and even discussed the chemistry behind carbolic acid, drawing from her own readings. Their partnership was rare in the scientific world of the time, one built on mutual respect rather than hierarchy. In the evenings, they would sometimes walk the narrow streets of Glasgow, hands clasped, discussing both microbes and morality, science and spirit. But outside the Lister household, time moved slowly. Years passed, and Lister's antiseptic method spread more by example than persuasion. Hospitals that implemented it properly began to see results. Still, many resisted. Some tried it sloppily and saw no improvement, then blamed the method rather than their execution. Others dismissed it as a passing fashion. Surgery, one critic wrote, should not be reduced to chemistry. But there were those who saw the truth clearly. In 1869, Lister was invited to return to Edinburgh as chair of clinical surgery. He accepted. The move signaled that, slowly, the tide was turning. Though not yet universally accepted, Lister's ideas had gained traction, and his name was now spoken in the same breath as progress. By then, he had saved countless lives, not with new tools, but with new thinking. And yet, Lister felt that his work had only just begun. He still saw infection in every ward, still read reports of sepsis and gangrene in hospitals across the country. It wasn't enough to publish or to prove, the world had to believe. And belief, as he had learned, was harder to spark than innovation itself. So he returned to Edinburgh, not as the quiet apprentice of James Syme, but as a pioneer, a man with a theory, a method, and a mission. He wasn't seeking fame, he was seeking change. Chapter 6. Resistance and Vindication. Changing minds, one wound at a time. When Joseph Lister returned to Edinburgh in 1869, the corridors of the Royal Infirmary felt familiar, but he was no longer the young assistant nervously shadowing James Syme. Now, as the chair of clinical surgery, he carried the weight of a theory that was dividing the medical world. In private, some called him a visionary. In public, many still labeled him a nuisance. But Lister had never been one to chase applause. His voice remained calm, his demeanor reserved, and his focus always fixed on his patients. Despite the growing evidence supporting his antiseptic methods, resistance to his ideas remained strong. Many senior surgeons saw Lister's insistence on carbolic acid as obsessive, even unmanly. A good surgeon, they believed, needed strong hands, not delicate hygiene. Their operations were acts of boldness, not chemistry. Some colleagues in Edinburgh refused to adopt his techniques at all. Others tried half-heartedly, neglecting the details, skipping steps, or using too strong a concentration of carbolic acid, which caused skin burns and irritation. When infections returned, they blamed the method, not their execution. Lister, for his part, remained unwavering. He lectured with meticulous clarity, laying out both theory and practice. He published more clinical data, refining his instructions. He invited observers into his operating theater, allowing skeptical surgeons to witness his procedures firsthand. And slowly, grudgingly, opinions began to shift. One of the earliest public turning points came in 1871, when Lister treated a railway worker with a deep laceration across the thigh, a wound nearly certain to become infected. The man was brought to the infirmary late at night, groaning in pain, soaked in blood and soot. Under lamplight, Lister cleaned the wound, carefully trimmed dead tissue, and applied his standard antiseptic dressings. To the astonishment of the staff, the man's condition improved steadily. No pus, no fever. Within a week, he was sitting upright. Within a month, he walked out unaided. Word of such recoveries spread, and with it, a growing realization: Lister's method, though demanding, worked. But acceptance was never simple. A prominent London surgeon, in a scathing editorial, declared the antiseptic system is a chemical fantasy, inappropriate to surgery and irrelevant to practical medicine. He warned young doctors against abandoning the common sense of tradition in favor of French theories and Scottish experiments. Lister responded not with fury, but with evidence. He published a follow-up article, patiently explaining the chemistry of carbolic acid, the biology of germs, and the case results from Glasgow and Edinburgh. He did not attack, he simply persisted. Meanwhile, his students, many of whom had adopted his methods faithfully, began achieving remarkable results across Britain. A young surgeon in Manchester reported a drastic decline in postoperative infections. Another in Dublin saved multiple amputation cases that would previously have ended in death. Slowly, the tide of skepticism began to shift. International voices, too, began to take notice. In Germany, physicians were intrigued by Lister's antiseptic theory and began testing it themselves. In France, Pasteur continued to support Lister, calling him the surgeon who brought life to germ theory. In the United States, young doctors returning from European study began spreading the word across hospitals in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. But Lister remained cautious. In private, he admitted to Agnes that the resistance wore on him, not because he desired fame, but because delay costs lives. Every lost day, he once wrote, is a wound that should have healed. Through it all, Agnes remained his steadying force. She helped him revise papers, organize notes, and respond to endless correspondence. She traveled with him to lectures, sat in the audience as he defended his views before doubtful peers, and supported him quietly when others grew loud. One memorable evening in 1875, at a packed medical conference in London, Lister presented a series of before and after case studies. On one side, pre-antiseptic cases, gangrenous limbs, festering abscesses, death. On the other, cases treated with carbolic technique, clean healing, minimal complications, survival. When he finished, there was silence. Then, one by one, surgeons stood to ask questions, not to mock, but to understand. It was not a standing ovation. It was something deeper, a turning point. Soon afterward, several leading British hospitals adopted Lister's methods in full. The British Army began to train its surgeons in antiseptic procedures. Medical journals that had once rejected his ideas now published glowing summaries. And for the first time, the Royal College of Surgeons formally acknowledged the significance of antisepsis. Vindication had come. Not with fanfare, but with proof. Still, Lister remained measured in his pride. He did not gloat. He did not rush to expand his method to every aspect of care. Instead, he continued testing, refining, and publishing. He knew that medicine moved slowly and that real change came not from revolution alone, but from repetition and reliability. By the end of the decade, he was not just a respected surgeon, he was becoming a symbol of transformation. The shift from filthy, frantic operating rooms to ordered, antiseptic theaters was underway. And though many still resisted, they could no longer deny that something had changed. The air, once filled with invisible death, was beginning to clear. Chapter 7. Across Borders. Taking Aseptic Techniques to the World. By the early 1870s, the name Joseph Lister was no longer just whispered in hospital corridors. It was spoken with growing reverence in lecture halls, debated in medical journals, and cautiously cited by surgeons from Berlin to Boston. But Lister himself remained much the same, quiet, methodical, and far more interested in outcomes than honors. The antiseptic method, however, was no longer just an experiment. It was becoming a movement. After years of resistance in Britain, Lister's influence began spreading internationally, first through his students, then through translated publications, and eventually through the global web of medical education. His carbolic acid technique, once viewed as a curious Scottish eccentricity, was now being studied and replicated by some of the most promising minds in medicine across Europe and North America. One of the most instrumental figures in this wave was Ernst von Bergmann, a German surgeon who, inspired by Lister's ideas, began promoting a related concept, aseptic surgery. While Lister focused on killing germs that had already contaminated wounds, Bergmann proposed that surgical environments should be kept entirely free of microorganisms from the beginning. His work in sterilizing instruments and using steam became an essential next step in the evolution Lister had started. Lister, far from being threatened, embraced this development. He welcomed improvement, even if it didn't bear his name. For him, the goal was not legacy, it was safety. But that didn't mean he was inactive. In 1877, Lister accepted a prestigious appointment at King's College Hospital in London. This move was significant. London was the heart of the British medical establishment, and until then, it had been largely resistant to Lister's methods. By stepping into this role, he placed himself at the epicenter of both opportunity and scrutiny. From the very first day, he brought his full antiseptic system to the capital. Carbolic sprays, sterilized instruments, carefully layered dressings, everything. Some senior staff scoffed, but the younger doctors watched with intense curiosity. Patients in Lister's care experienced lower infection rates, faster recoveries, and reduced need for amputations. The data spoke louder than any critic could. That same year, Lister also performed a public surgery that became a landmark moment. In front of a packed operating theater in London, he successfully treated a young boy with a serious knee injury. Using his antiseptic technique, he avoided infection, preserved the leg, and demonstrated to a room full of skeptics that his system wasn't just theory, it was practice. Afterward, newspapers reported the operation, and interest soared. Around this time, invitations began arriving from across the globe. France, Germany, Italy, even the United States wanted to hear directly from the man whose theories had begun reshaping surgical norms. Though never comfortable in the spotlight, Lister agreed to lecture tours, bringing not only his ideas, but also his humble intensity to international audiences. In 1878, he was invited to speak at the International Medical Congress in Amsterdam, where his speech, delivered with careful passion, left a lasting impression. He explained, in precise but accessible terms, how antisepsis was not just about chemical treatment, but about a change in mindset, that surgeons were no longer battling only the visible, but the invisible. You cannot see the germ, he told the crowd, but you can see its effect, and you can prevent it. The message resonated. What had once been dismissed as a speculative theory was now accepted as life-saving science. But his impact wasn't limited to hospitals and lecture halls. Public awareness of antiseptic methods also began to rise. Mothers read about Lister's work and started demanding cleaner conditions in maternity wards. Soldiers, after hearing how antisepsis reduced death in field operations, pleaded for army doctors trained in Listerian techniques. Even journalists, once skeptical, began praising him as a silent revolutionist and the man who banished surgical death. One of the most poignant moments of Lister's international influence came during a visit to Paris. There, he was invited to meet Louis Pasteur, whose germ theory had been instrumental in shaping Lister's work. The two men, speaking through translators and respectful gestures, shared their admiration. Pasteur, despite suffering from illness, stood and lifted his glass. To Lister, he said, who has saved more lives than all the wars of this century have taken. For once, Lister was speechless. Despite his success, however, the road remained uneven. In some regions, hospitals refused to invest in antiseptic supplies. In others, poorly trained surgeons misused his methods, leading to inconsistent results and renewed skepticism. Lister responded by refining his techniques again, reducing reliance on the sometimes irritating carbolic spray, improving instructions for sterilizing tools, and emphasizing aseptic rather than antiseptic preparation. He also continued teaching. To students, he emphasized not just cleanliness, but attitude. Surgery, he said, was not only a technical act, it was a moral responsibility. Every careless movement could cost a life. Every ignored precaution could undo years of progress. By the 1880s, Lister's methods were recognized as essential in every major teaching hospital in Europe. Medical textbooks were rewritten, surgical instruments were redesigned. Entire hospital wings were rebuilt to accommodate sterilized environments. Lister, who had once been mocked for spraying chemicals in the air, was now knighted for his contributions. And yet, he still walked the hospital halls with quiet observation, often stopping to speak with nurses, asking about supplies, checking dressings, and reminding junior staff to wash their hands. He never stopped improving. Chapter 8. From Skepticism to Standard: Building a Medical Legacy. By the dawn of the 1880s, Joseph Lister was no longer merely a name in the margins of medical journals. He had become a symbol, quiet, stoic, and transformative. What had once been seen as eccentric methods born in the misty wards of Glasgow had now traveled across oceans, altered textbooks, and saved lives in operating rooms from Berlin to Boston. And yet, Lister remained strangely untouched by the grandeur that accompanied his influence. Though accolades began to pile up, he received them with the same quiet resolve he had always carried, more concerned with gauze and carbolic acid than with fame or fortune. But the world was watching, and it began to speak with admiration. In 1883, Queen Victoria recognized his contributions by conferring upon him a baronetcy, an honor previously reserved mostly for generals, politicians, and men of wealth. Lister was now Sir Joseph Lister, Baronet of Park Crescent. The ceremony was elegant, the guests distinguished, and the applause sincere. Yet Lister seemed ill at ease amid the velvet and gold of the royal court. He bowed respectfully, but looked faintly distracted, as if part of him still lingered in a surgical ward, thinking about an open wound that needed tending. The recognition didn't end there. In 1887, he was appointed president of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, a rare post for a surgeon. There, he gave a speech, calm and methodical as always, detailing not only his antiseptic methods but also the evolution of the mindset behind them. To overcome infection, he told the audience, we must first overcome disbelief. It was more than a line. It was a reflection of decades spent navigating doubt. But behind the praise lay something deeper: change. In hospital after hospital, the transformation was visible. Gone were the days of blood-stained aprons reused without washing, of knives wiped on pant legs and reused from patient to patient. The once overcrowded, festering wards began to resemble places of healing. Patients no longer whispered of surgery as a near-certain death sentence. With Lister's methods, and now the emerging aseptic practices, they had a fighting chance. Young doctors, too, had changed. Lister's former students, now scattered across Britain and the globe, passed on not only his techniques, but his attitude toward care. For them, surgery was no longer an act of brute precision. It was a solemn promise. A surgeon had a duty to respect the invisible risks, to treat every cut with vigilance, and to honor the delicate balance between intervention and infection. Among these new voices, Lister's humility stood out even more starkly. He never once claimed sole credit for the antiseptic revolution. He praised Pasteur whenever given the chance, acknowledged the improvements made by colleagues abroad, and refused to position himself as the infallible authority. He often reminded his students, what we know today may be questioned tomorrow. Be ready to change, as long as it is for the better. This attitude gained him admiration, not just as a scientist, but as a human being. And yet, even as medicine raced forward on the current of his work, Lister continued to revise and rethink. He quietly reduced his use of the carbolic spray, which he acknowledged had caused unnecessary irritation. He began advocating more for sterilization before surgery rather than treatment afterward, anticipating what would soon become the age of aseptic surgery, a natural progression from his own discoveries. In 1890, when Lister was elected president of the Royal Society, Britain's most prestigious scientific institution, it became clear the man once ridiculed in the press as the carbolic zealot was now recognized as a pioneer not just of surgery, but of modern science. And yet, true to form, he used his platform not to boast, but to continue advocating for patient safety. He lobbied for reforms in hospital architecture, stricter medical education standards, and a global sharing of scientific knowledge. He even began encouraging the use of rubber gloves in surgery, a practice that would not become standard until well into the 20th century. Behind the scenes, his life remained rooted in simplicity. He and Agnes lived quietly, surrounded by papers, books, and memories of long hours in the operating room. He declined many social invitations and spoke publicly only when he believed it would further the cause of medical progress. He was often described by peers as modest to a fault, but those closest to him understood it was not false humility. It was conviction that the work must always matter more than the man. Still, Lister was not immune to reflection. In private moments, he would sit in his study, hands folded, and read over his early notes from Glasgow. He was astonished at how far medicine had come, and quietly hopeful about how much farther it could still go. One of his last major public appearances was in 1897, during Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee celebrations, when he was elevated to the peerage as Baron Lister of Lyme Regis. He became the first physician ever to receive a British hereditary peerage, an honor that astounded even his detractors. As the ceremony ended and the applause rang out across Westminster, Lister bowed gently. When a journalist later asked him how it felt to become a lord, Lister simply said, "I am more pleased when the wound heals than when the crown shines." In those few words, the essence of Joseph Lister was captured, not in title, but in purpose. He was now in his 70s. His hair had turned white. His steps were slower, and his hands, once so steady in surgery, had begun to tremble, but the mind behind them remained sharp, curious, and focused. His life's work was no longer a theory, or a hope, or an argument. It was a standard. Copyright notice. Cool English Channel. All rights reserved. This video and its content are protected by copyright law. Unauthorized copying, redistribution, re-uploading, or modification of this content is strictly prohibited and may result in legal action. Respect the creator. Do not steal. Chapter 9. The Elder Statesman. Honors, Reflections, and Final Innovations. In the final years of the 19th century, Joseph Lister became something of a living monument, admired, decorated, and frequently cited as one of the most important figures in modern medicine. Yet, to those who knew him personally, he remained curiously unchanged. Time had made his name grander, but not his manner. He was now Baron Lister of Lyme Regis, the first surgeon to be granted a hereditary peerage in British history. Royal invitations arrived frequently. His face appeared in textbooks and newspaper sketches, and visiting doctors requested meetings as though approaching a sacred oracle. Still, Lister kept his routine modest, reading, writing, observing, and quietly mentoring the next generation of physicians. His wife, Agnes, continued to be his closest confidant. She remained intellectually engaged with his work and continued editing his writings, adding clarity to his often heavily technical drafts or gently pointing out when he was repeating himself. Their marriage was, by all accounts, a partnership of minds as much as hearts. Even as his public duties expanded, Lister never gave up his scientific curiosity. At a time when many would have retired into comfort, he continued conducting experiments in microbiology and surgical preparation. He frequently corresponded with younger scientists, offering ideas or asking questions. He praised what he admired and was frank when he disagreed, but always respectful. One area that fascinated him in these later years was sterilization by heat and steam, as practiced in aseptic surgery. Though carbolic acid had been his great innovation, he saw the merits in moving beyond it. He knew that science must evolve, and he welcomed it. "Better ideas must not wait," he once wrote to a colleague. "They must be given room to breathe, even if they displace our own." In 1899, shortly before the turn of the century, Lister was asked to chair a royal commission on the use of antiseptics in war medicine. The commission reviewed field hospital practices during the Boer War, and Lister was dismayed by what he found: limited hygiene, untrained medical personnel, and preventable deaths caused by infection. He advocated for sweeping reforms, including mandatory antiseptic protocols for battlefield surgeons and the establishment of proper surgical units closer to the front lines. The report was influential. It shaped future British military medical policy and saved countless lives in the years to come, including during World War I, which Lister would not live to see. Despite his enduring activity, physical decline crept in. His hands, once so steady with a scalpel, grew increasingly arthritic. Writing became slower. Walking required a cane. He stopped performing surgeries, though he still observed them from time to time, standing silently in the background like a watchful guardian of the past. He would often place a gentle hand on a young surgeon's shoulder afterward, offering advice in quiet tones. "Do not rush to cut. Patience prevents error." It was during these twilight years that Lister began reflecting more openly on his journey. In letters and interviews, he rarely spoke of personal pride. Instead, he referred to the lives saved, the students trained, the errors avoided. If he looked back, it was only to better illuminate the path forward. One former student recalled a striking moment in 1902, when Lister stood gazing out the window of King's College Hospital, watching the rain darken the cobbled stones of the courtyard. He said softly, "When I began, we could not speak the word cure without trembling. Now, we speak of prevention." There was no self-congratulation in his tone, only wonder. A particularly poignant event occurred in 1901, when Queen Victoria passed away. Lister had treated her personally in 1871 after an abscess formed in her armpit, a procedure many believed had saved her life. Now, as the Queen's funeral procession passed through London, Lister stood quietly among the other lords in mourning attire. The Empire had changed. The era he helped shape was drawing to a close. In 1903, another deep loss struck. Agnes passed away after a short illness. The grief was profound. For over 4 decades, she had been his unwavering companion, his editor, encourager, and emotional anchor. Without her, Lister seemed dimmed. He withdrew from public events for a time, retreating to his home in Walmer, near the Kentish coast. There, surrounded by sea air and the sounds of distant gulls, he began organizing his papers, revisiting old notebooks, and rereading the letters Agnes had saved over the years. Each margin note in her handwriting brought a flicker of memory and, perhaps, comfort. Though quieter than ever, he was not idle. He continued to respond to letters from young doctors, some from as far away as India and Japan. He read journals and made annotations, occasionally submitting short essays to scientific publications. He also spent time reflecting on the philosophy of medicine, pondering how future doctors might stay grounded in a rapidly industrializing world. In one letter, he wrote, "Let them never forget that behind every incision lies a person's trust. Science is powerful, but compassion is its compass." By 1909, Lister's health had weakened significantly. He suffered from declining eyesight and shortness of breath. Though he still walked his garden path each morning, the steps were short and slow. On Sundays, he listened quietly as a neighbor read scripture aloud, often pausing to ask questions about healing, redemption, and purpose. He was not especially religious in a traditional sense, but his Quaker upbringing had left a lasting impression: simplicity, integrity, and service. As the new century marched forward, Joseph Lister watched from the shadows of history. He had become something rare, a man whose legacy grew louder even as he grew quieter. In September 1912, at the age of 84, Lister passed away peacefully in his home. There was no dramatic illness, no final declaration, just a gradual drifting into silence. The response from around the world was immediate and heartfelt. Newspapers across Europe, the United States, and beyond carried headlines honoring the man who saved more lives than any soldier, transformed surgery into science, and taught doctors to see the invisible. Hospitals flew flags at half-mast, medical schools held memorial lectures, even political leaders paid tribute, acknowledging that Lister's work had influenced not only medicine but the moral structure of care itself. He was buried beside Agnes in West Hampstead Cemetery in London, where their shared gravestone bears a simple inscription: Joseph Lister, who gave to surgery its safety. It was a quiet ending for a man who never sought to be loud, but even in silence, his voice echoes. Chapter 10. After Lister, the Invisible Legacy. When Joseph Lister passed away in 1912, the world mourned a man whose innovations had permanently reshaped the face of medicine. Yet, unlike the thunderous departure of a monarch or military hero, Lister's exit from the world stage was gentle. And fittingly so, his greatest contributions were not loud proclamations, but quiet revolutions, made visible only in the healed wounds, the recovered patients, and the absence of infection. But what happened after Lister? The years following his death revealed the true measure of his impact. While his name adorned hospitals, lecture halls, and statues, his most enduring legacy was not carved in stone. It was practiced every day in operating rooms across the globe. Within 2 decades of his death, antiseptic and aseptic techniques had become the international norm. Surgeons in New York, Tokyo, Paris, and Johannesburg operated under strict sterilization protocols. Instruments were autoclaved. Surgical gloves became standard. Surgeons washed not only their hands, but their consciences, adopting a new ethos of care, one that prioritized prevention over bravado. And while many younger doctors no longer used carbolic acid spray, the pungent fog Lister once championed, they all walked through the doors that Lister had opened. Techniques had evolved, but the principle remained that invisible enemies like bacteria could be conquered through vigilance, science, and respect for the patient. His students became torchbearers of this new medical standard. Men like William Chain and Barclay Moynihan, once young observers in Lister's operating theater, now led surgical departments and taught generations of physicians. In their lectures, they didn't just reference Lister, they quoted him, imitated his tone, and invoked his philosophy. It was not merely a set of rules they passed on, but a culture. Meanwhile, Lister's influence extended far beyond surgery. Fields like obstetrics, dentistry, wound care, and even veterinary medicine adopted antiseptic thinking. The concept of sterile environments transformed not only operating rooms but also maternity wards, laboratories, and battlefield hospitals. The 20th century saw the rise of antibiotics, but even these pharmacological miracles did not replace Lister's legacy. In fact, they confirmed it, that the microscopic world mattered, and that healing was as much about prevention as it was about cure. Hospitals that had once been dangerous places, rife with cross-contamination and death, became places of hope. Mortality rates dropped. Surgery became routine. People lived not just longer, but safely. And yet, amid this transformation, Lister's name began to fade from public memory, at least outside medical circles. He did not become the subject of novels or films, There were no epic biographies taught in schools, no national holidays declared. Perhaps it was because he had no dramatic scandals, no political crusades, no fierce public rivalries. His legacy was not theatrical, it was clinical, quiet, and fundamental. But within the medical world, his memory endured with almost sacred reverence. In 1924, Lister House was opened at the Royal College of Surgeons as a tribute to his work. In 1949, the Lister Medal was established, awarded to surgeons who made outstanding contributions to surgical science. Recipients of the award, many of them Nobel laureates, often remarked that to be associated with Lister's name was as great an honor as any prize. Interestingly, Lister's approach to humility also became part of his legacy. He taught generations of doctors not only what to do, but how to be. He modeled restraint, ethical clarity, and the understanding that medicine was not a performance, but a responsibility. One medical historian later wrote, "In Lister, we find the surgeon not as showman, but as servant." As the 20th century marched on, with wars, vaccines, pandemics, and revolutions in genetics, Lister's name would sometimes resurface during key moments in medical history. When penicillin was mass-produced during World War II, doctors remembered Lister's belief in unseen pathogens. When sterile techniques prevented maternal deaths in developing countries, researchers pointed back to Lister's insistence on hospital hygiene. His work laid the philosophical and procedural groundwork for modern infection control, long before the term existed. In 2002, the BBC conducted a poll titled 100 Greatest Britons. While Lister did not make the top 10, those within the medical community quietly pointed out that without him, many of the others might not have survived their illnesses long enough to make history. What endures most, perhaps, is a shift in how medicine sees its role. Lister helped change the intent of the surgeon from daring hero to careful guardian. No longer was a successful surgery measured solely by the removal of a tumor or the repair of a limb. It was measured by what came afterward, the wound that healed without infection, the life that continued untroubled, the patient who lived not in pain, but in peace. In this, Lister continues to operate in silence, in every sterile field, in every scrubbed hand and gloved touch. His story is told each time a surgeon pauses to ensure a tool is clean, or a nurse reminds a colleague to wash their hands. His voice speaks not through speeches, but through protocols, precautions, and professionalism. To study Lister is to understand that progress can come not with grand declarations, but with persistent compassion and careful thought. He once wrote, near the end of his life, "If I have helped others to see more clearly, that is reward enough." And indeed, he helped generations see clearly what they had long overlooked, that healing begins not with the cut, but with the care surrounding it. Thanks for learning with Ku English. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time.